Friends, thank you for being here today. What if I told you that on Valentine's Day weekend 2026, the United States government shut down critical domestic security agencies because the executive branch refused to accept judicial oversight of federal agents who have killed American citizens on American soil? And what if I told you that while the Transportation Security Administration, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the Coast Guard lost funding and stopped operations, Immigration and Customs Enforcement continued conducting raids with $75 billion in protected funding that congressional Democrats cannot touch? This is not a story about immigration policy or border security. This is a story about the collapse of constitutional governance and the transformation of federal law enforcement from agencies that protect Americans into organizations that operate beyond accountability oversight or the basic legal protections that have defined American democracy for 2 centuries. The catalyst for this unprecedented constitutional crisis began with 2 deaths that should have never happened. On January 7th, Renee Good, a mother of 3, was fatally shot by an Immigration and Customs Enforcement officer during a raid in Minneapolis. 24 hours later, Alex Preddy, an intensive care nurse, was killed in another shooting involving federal law enforcement in the same city. Both victims were American citizens. Neither had committed any crime. Both died because federal agents operating without identification, without judicial warrants, and without body cameras entered private spaces and used lethal force against people who pose no threat to public safety. In any functioning democracy, the deaths of innocent citizens by government agents would trigger immediate accountability measures and systematic reform. Instead, the Trump administration doubled down on protecting the agencies responsible, while demanding that Congress fund them without conditions or oversight. The constitutional implications of what is happening extend far beyond immigration enforcement. We are witnessing the emergence of a federal police force that operates according to different rules than every other law enforcement agency in America. State and local police departments across the country are required to wear identification, obtain judicial warrants before entering private property, and increasingly use body cameras to document their interactions with civilians. These requirements exist because decades of civil rights litigation established that constitutional protections mean nothing without mechanisms to enforce accountability. Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents, by contrast, have been operating under emergency authorities that exempt them from basic oversight requirements that apply to other federal agencies. They conduct raids wearing masks and tactical gear without name tags or badge numbers. They enter homes, businesses, schools, and hospitals based on administrative warrants issued by immigration judges rather than judicial warrants issued by federal courts. They are not required to wear body cameras or document their use of force. When they kill American citizens, there is no independent investigation, no accountability mechanism, and no consequence for misconduct. The Department of Homeland Security shutdown represents the first time since Reconstruction that Congress has been willing to defund federal law enforcement agencies to force accountability for killing American citizens. House Minority Leader Hakeem Jeffries and Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer have taken the position that funding Homeland Security requires accepting basic oversight mechanisms that already apply to every other federal agency. Democratic demands are not radical departures from established law enforcement practices. They want Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents to wear identification so that misconduct can be traced to specific officers. They want judicial warrants rather than administrative warrants for entering private property, maintaining the same Fourth Amendment protections that apply to FBI and Drug Enforcement Administration operations. They want body cameras to document interactions between federal agents and civilians, a requirement that has become standard practice for local police departments nationwide. They want independent oversight of use of force incidents, ensuring that when federal agents kill American citizens, the investigations are conducted by agencies that do not report to the same chain of command. The Trump administration has rejected every one of these accountability measures while insisting that Congress provide additional funding and expanded authorities for immigration enforcement. President Trump's response to the Minneapolis killings was not to apologize for the deaths of American citizens nor promise reforms to prevent future tragedies. Instead, he praised Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers for doing a great job and suggested that critics of federal law enforcement have gone crazy. The institutional response reveals how completely the constitutional balance between executive power and legislative oversight has been broken. In previous government shutdowns, even during periods of divided government, both sides acknowledged that essential services needed to continue while negotiations proceeded. The current crisis is different because the Trump administration designed the funding structure to make immigration enforcement immune from congressional oversight, while making other homeland security functions hostage to political negotiations. The $75 billion that Congress allocated to immigration and customs enforcement last year was packaged in the one big beautiful bill that funded tax cuts and infrastructure projects. By separating immigration enforcement funding from annual appropriations, the administration created a scenario where ICE operations can continue indefinitely without congressional approval, while agencies that protect Americans from natural disasters, terrorist threats, and transportation security lose funding whenever Congress demands accountability. This funding structure represents a deliberate subversion of constitutional governance. The power of the purse has been the primary mechanism through which Congress exercises oversight of executive branch agencies since the founding of the Republic. And when federal agencies operate without accountability, Congress has historically used appropriations as leverage to demand reforms, investigations, and personnel changes. By insulating immigration and customs enforcement from annual appropriations while making other homeland security functions dependent on congressional approval, the administration has effectively inverted the constitutional relationship between legislative and executive power. The practical implications are visible across the country as the shutdown enters its second day. Transportation Security Administration agents are working without pay, creating delays and security concerns at airports nationwide. Federal Emergency Management Agency operations have been suspended, leaving communities vulnerable to natural disasters and unable to access emergency assistance programs. Coast Guard personnel are conducting search and rescue operations without salary, undermining maritime security and safety operations along America's coastlines. Meanwhile, immigration and customs enforcement agents continue conducting raids in Minneapolis, Detroit, Chicago, and Los Angeles with full funding and expanded tactical support. The agency has not modified its procedures in response to the American citizen deaths. Officers continue operating without identification or body cameras. Raids continue targeting schools, hospitals, and houses of worship without judicial warrants. The use of masks and tactical gear that prevents identification of individual agents remains standard practice. The political calculus behind this strategy reflects a broader transformation in how the executive branch views constitutional constraints on federal power. Traditional Republican theory holds that government agencies derive legitimacy from democratic oversight and accountability to elected officials who represent the people and interests. The current approach treats accountability mechanisms as obstacles to effective governance rather than essential features of democratic legitimacy. Congressional Republicans have defended the administration's position by arguing that immigration enforcement is inherently different from other federal law enforcement activities and therefore requires different rules. This argument ignores the fundamental principle that constitutional protections apply to all persons within American territory, regardless of immigration status, and that federal agents who kill American citizens must be subject to the same accountability mechanisms that govern state and local law enforcement. The international implications extend far beyond immigration policy. Allied nations cooperating with American intelligence agencies have begun questioning whether the United States maintains rule of law necessary for sustained partnerships. When federal agents operate without identification or judicial oversight, Democratic allies cannot justify sharing intelligence with agencies that violate basic governance principles. The historical precedent is troubling. During Reconstruction, federal troops operated with minimal oversight. During wartime, agents conducted raids without judicial warrants. During the Cold War, federal agencies surveilled domestic organizations without legal authorization. Each period represented departures from constitutional governance, later recognized as fundamental violations, requiring reforms to prevent recurrence. The mathematical certainty of additional American citizen deaths should concern anyone who believes that federal agencies must operate within constitutional constraints. When law enforcement officers operate without identification, judicial oversight, or accountability for misconduct, the statistical likelihood of wrongful deaths, excessive force, and civil rights violations increases exponentially. Every raid conducted without judicial warrants creates opportunities for tragedy. Every interaction between masked federal agents and American civilians creates potential for fatal misunderstandings. The administrative response reveals complete abandonment of democratic accountability. Instead of implementing reforms to prevent civilian deaths, the Department of Homeland Security focused on communication strategies to minimize political damage while preserving operational independence from oversight. Secretary Kristi Noem announced Minneapolis agents would receive body cameras, but this cosmetic gesture doesn't address the fundamental crisis. Body cameras are worthless without independent review if officers can disable them, and without consequences for failing to activate recording equipment. Friends, what we are witnessing is not a policy disagreement about immigration enforcement. We are watching the systematic destruction of constitutional governance through the creation of federal law enforcement agencies that operate beyond democratic accountability. When Congress cannot use the power of the purse to ensure that federal agents operate within constitutional constraints, the fundamental balance of power that defines American democracy has been eliminated. The choice facing Congress is not whether to fund immigration enforcement or protect homeland security. The choice is whether federal agencies will operate according to constitutional principles or whether executive branch agencies will be permitted to kill American citizens without accountability, oversight, or consequences. Every day that Immigration and Customs Enforcement continues operations without judicial oversight, identification requirements, or accountability mechanisms, the precedent becomes more entrenched that federal agents can operate as an occupying army within American territory. The international community is watching how the United States resolves this constitutional crisis, because the outcome will determine whether American democracy can maintain the rule of law principles that have defined democratic governance for generations. If Congress capitulates to executive branch demands for funding without accountability, every democratic nation will understand that the United States has abandoned the institutional constraints that prevent federal agencies from becoming instruments of domestic repression. The most troubling aspect of this crisis is how readily congressional Republicans have accepted the transformation of federal law enforcement from agencies that protect constitutional rights into organizations that systematically violate them. When elected officials defend federal agents who kill American citizens while arguing that accountability mechanisms undermine effective governance, they are explicitly rejecting the democratic principle that government power must be constrained by law and oversight. The ultimate resolution of this crisis will determine whether constitutional governance can survive the systematic assault on democratic institutions that has defined the past decade of American politics. If federal agencies can operate without judicial oversight, congressional accountability, or consequences for killing American citizens, then the constitutional protections that distinguish democratic governance from authoritarian rule have been effectively eliminated.